Good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me. In fact, I invited myself into this meeting. But having said that, I'm a very sort of a new entrant into this field. So as a new entrant, I know very little. And my talk, therefore, shall be very brief. Can I have the next slide, please? Preparing the Pilgrim was something that I, like a new entrant into the field, I scoured the internet to see whether I can find anything at all about Hindu mass gatherings and preparation of the pilgrims. Sadly, I largely drew a blank. And the only two pilgrimages, one is a mass gathering, the other isn't so much of a mass gathering. The first is the Sabarimala pilgrimage. Sabarimala is in south of India. I'll talk about that briefly. And the Kailash Mansarovar pilgrimage, on which I have been and feel absolutely absolved of all my sins. Preparing the pilgrim, sorry, can I have the next slide, please? The Sabarimala pilgrimage is something that is undertaken by mostly menfolk. The pre-pubertal girls and postmenopausal women are allowed. A recent Supreme Court judgment has announced that women will be allowed on this pilgrimage, but that has given no end of problems. It's a law and order situation at Sabarimala even as we speak. Now, where is the Sabarimala? Sorry, can I have the next slide, please? The Sabarimala is in the Western Ghats. Ghats are mountainous range, which is on the western side of India, coming down from Bombay downwards down to Kerala. And it's a very picturesque place, and high up in the mountains, in dense forest, is this Sabarimala. And as you'd imagine, the Sabarimala temple is absolutely spectacular. It's very different from most other Indian temples which have got a towering over structure. This is very flat, very much like some of the Southeast Asian temples in Thailand and elsewhere. It's very, very beautiful, and it was something that only very few people went to in the past. Can I have the next slide? It is the temple deity is somebody called Ayyappan. Ayyappan was born to two gods, the god Vishnu and god Shiva. Both were males. One of the gods transformed for the purposes of the birth of Ayyappan into a female, and then, of course, reconverted into a male. So Ayyappan was born to slay a demon Mahisha, who was creating havoc in the mortal world, and even in the sort of the world of gods. This god was born to two super gods, and he then slayed the demon. And having slain the demon, he went on to this forest and led a life of an ascetic. To go to this temple, you got to trek barefooted through a dense forest full of thorns, and I believe in the days gone by, before we killed them all, we had tigers, and of course we still do have elephants. So in this dense forest, you have thorns and your pebbles, and the people go about chanting Kalum Mullum Kalakamettai, which means the pebbles and the stones and the thorns are like velvet under our feet. So it's sort of psyching themselves in not to feel the pain. So it is mainly a pilgrimage undertaken by able-limbed males. Occasionally, less able people do it as well. Because now, of course, you have trains going right up to the foothills of this forest, of this temple. In order to prepare for this, it's a spiritual exercise, and most of the training they undergo is a spiritual one. On the day, about 41 days before their journey, their pilgrimage, they undertake a vow, and as a part of this vow, they say they will not eat non-vegetarian food, they will not drink, they will be celibate, they will not see films because they might give rise to feelings which are not necessarily compatible with spiritualism, and so on and so forth. And they walk everywhere barefooted as far as possible, and that trains the body, I think, to become, and they wash themselves as well. and they devote to, and they go to the temple for prayers. And this is the only preparation that I've seen, which I can find from the internet and from word of mouth from my older brother and other colleagues who are more spiritual than I am. This is the only thing that has been described in terms of preparation. So now I take you on to a more picturesque part of the world. That was picturesque enough. Kerala, those of you who have not been, I certainly suggest that is a God's own country. I had the good fortune to go on this Kailash Mansarovar trip. Now, I'll tell you a little more. The Mount Kailash is in Tibet, and Kailash is at a height of 21,776 feet. Just to set the context, the Mount Everest is 29,008 feet. So not far short of that. It is possibly at the same height of the base camp of Mount Everest. It's certainly not a mass tourism. I cannot imagine that people, what's more, the Tibetan government and the Chinese government and the Indian government do not allow mass pilgrimage. Every year only 25,000 or 20,000 permits are given for people to go up the Kailash Mansarovar trip. This lake is known as the Mansarovar Lake. It's a beautiful crystal blue, clear, turquoise blue lake, which is high up in the mountains and is an amazing sight to behold. And mythologically, the gods used to come and bathe themselves and here. And more recently, of course, everybody says, if you bathe in this water, you are absolved of all your sins. I didn't do that. And it was freezing cold, so I was not going to do that. Now, where is it? This Kailash Mansarovar, as I mentioned to you, is in Tibet, and the way you can approach it is either through Kathmandu or from India. So most Indians come through the Indian route, they just across Nepal and go to Mount Kailash. And Lucknow, as you can see, is in Uttar Pradesh, and Delhi. So you fly in from Delhi to Lucknow, and Lucknow to Nepalganj, and thereon you do the trek. The people who come from abroad, like me, or from America, would go to Kathmandu, and from Kathmandu, you either go by land or by helicopter to Mansarovar Lake, and then thereon do the trekking. I mean, the trekking is quite arduous. I mean, I found it quite difficult. I'm not an unfit person. I play sport, but it is quite challenging. And clearly, large numbers are not, but they have mules there for the less abled people to climb. And one of the biggest problems that they have is one of acclimatization. A lot of people do not acclimatize themselves and get into all sorts of problems. Certainly, there was one chap who came with us, a doctor from West Bengal. He came and had a dip in this Mansarovar. The next thing we found him in a state of coma. And we thought it was a hypoglycemic coma, that is, he was a diabetic. We thought he didn't have enough sugar in him. So we stuffed his mouth with sugar, it made no difference. And 10 days later on, he was still in the ICU in the main hospital in Kathmandu. So what does the Indian government do for the pilgrims? They have an eligibility criteria. They say only people between 18 and 70 are allowed. There's no gender discrimination there. They do not allow anybody with a BMI of more than 27. The BMI of 27 is big, but not huge. And so clearly, they have fairly strict standards of how big. And I suppose you can train yourself to bring yourself to be less than 27 before you travel. And of course, they ask you to undergo a physical test even soon after application in order for your application to be considered. The selection is through a lottery, and once you get selected in the lottery, you go for the medical examination. And what's more, when you go there at the height of 3,500, they once again do a test whether you're coping well enough. They look at your heart rate, they look at your blood pressure to see whether you're coping. So there's no preparation as such, but I suppose these criteria will obviously prompt people to become fit before they travel. There's a lot of website advice on pre-trek advice saying that sort of spread your trip such that you have enough time for acclimatization. You can have the, you must be prepared with warm clothes, you must exercise before going, and so on and so forth. Can I have the next slide? Next slide, please. And then, of course, check your blood sugar, creatinine for whatever it's worth. And they recommend taking multivitamins. I don't think it's terribly useful. And neither do I think is the calcium. But that's what they say. And this is very much a middle-class venture to go there. It's not something that all the people that I saw there were pretty much middle-class, except for the Tibetan Buddhist. I forgot to tell you, the Kailash Mansarovar is a pilgrimage for three main religions, the Hinduism, the Buddhism, and Jainism. And therefore, when I went on the trip, lots of people who were less well off were necessarily Buddhists from Tibet. And the year I went was the year of the horse, was especially auspicious for them. Next slide, please. All that is fine. What about pre-travel advice for the 120 million who entered the Kumbh Mela? Or indeed, I want to tell you that the Ganges is one of the most polluted waters. And it has been shown in various studies that the water in this Ganges is sometimes no better than the sewerage. And in this, everyone has to dip. As Dr. Pari told you earlier on, the object of going to Kumbh Mela is to dip in the sacred river. And every day, as many as 30 million people dip in this water. The fecal count in this is 7 times more than what you would expect. And fecal coliform count is just an estimation of fecal contamination. And every time the water goes in, now I don't know what happens. Why don't people get ill? It's $1 million question. In fact, people probably do get ill, get gastroenteritis, and they're quite a hardy bunch, the people who go there. The second thing is, of course, there have been outbreaks. And somebody asked a question earlier on, why have there not been outbreaks? There have been outbreaks in the past, not necessarily more recently, but in the past, there are massive cholera outbreak in the last century. When I say last century, I'm talking about 1850s and 1860s. There was a massive outbreak of, remember, the cholera started from the Gangetic Plain. The Ganges flows through some of the most fertile part of India, and the Gangetic Plain was where the cholera started. It started in the Gangetic Plain, moved through West Asia, come into Russia, and then came into the United Kingdom, even those days. And for those of you, a little bit of trivia, the saline therapy that we have used today is as a result of treatment of cholera. That was first discovered by a chap called Dr. O'Shaughnessy in Sunderland. So nowadays we can't put Sunderland and cholera together, but that's where it happened. And it all came from Indian Gangetic Plain. The British soldiers were being felled because of this. So moving on, can I have the next slide? The next slide sort of is a very interesting thing. People may not necessarily agree with the geographical depiction of the country, but that's what we say it is. But what you can see there is a number of pilgrimages that happen throughout the country, most of them along the coastal side. And it's one thing to think about controlling preparing the pilgrim. How do you prepare the pilgrim on those so many pilgrimages? Can I have the next slide? So to you and for me, the challenge really is pre-travel health advice necessary? And we all observe there are not that many deaths and there are not that many illnesses. Really, is it worth the time and effort? I suspect the answer is yes, but really we have not had any major outbreaks of infection as far as we know. And the second thing is it feasible and possible at a scale that would be required in a country with limited resources with a population of 1.2 billion? I'll leave you to ponder that. Thank you very much.